XRP Chronicle, production. Script generated 2026-06-25. Topic: JPMorgan and Mastercard. XRP Ledger Treasury. Transfer documentary format, long-form documentary, target, 18-22 minutes. Model, Claude Sonnet, video title, JPMorgan and Mastercard. Just use the XRP Ledger. Here's exactly what happened. Hook 0-025. On June 25, 2026, two institutions that collectively touch more than $5 trillion in global daily financial flows executed a cross-border United States Treasury transfer. No announcement ceremony, no press conference, no viral tweet. The documentation appeared quietly, the way institutional events always do. The infrastructure they used was not SWIFT. It was not a proprietary bank chain. It was not a private, permissioned ledger built behind closed doors. It was the XRP Ledger. What you are about to hear is not speculation. It is not a price prediction. It is not a theory about what might happen. It is the documented record of what already did. Derchyats Act 1, the transaction 0-25-4. Let us start, as we always do at XRP Chronicle, with the facts as they have been confirmed. JPMorgan Chase, the largest bank in the United States by total assets, operating in over 60 countries, managing more than $3 trillion in assets, and Mastercard, whose payment network processes over 10 billion transactions every single year, executed a documented cross-border tokenized United States Treasury transfer. The settlement infrastructure they selected was the public XRP Ledger. Take a moment with that sentence, not a private chain, not a sandbox environment reserved for institutional testing. The public XRP Ledger, the same ledger that has been running continuously since 2012, processed this transaction. United States Treasuries are the world's reserve asset. They are denominated in the world's reserve currency. They are held by central banks, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and the largest institutional investors on the planet. When governments need to store value, they buy treasuries. When institutions need collateral, they post treasuries. When the global financial system needs an anchor, treasuries are that anchor. When institutions of the caliber of JPMorgan and Mastercard move treasury instruments, not simulate the movement, not pilot the concept in a controlled environment, but execute a live cross-border transfer, the infrastructure they select is itself a declaration, and they selected the XRP Ledger. Now here is what the full documented record shows. This is not the first time these institutions have touched XRP Ledger infrastructure for Treasury settlement. The prior record includes a documented pilot. The same Treasury fund was moved between a public blockchain and a permissioned chain. That pilot established the architecture and the operational proof of concept. What happened in this current reporting cycle is the documented progression beyond that pilot. The key distinction between the prior pilot and this transaction is architectural. The prior pilot required a bridge, a layer of infrastructure connecting the public chain to the permissioned chain. Every bridge layer is additional complexity, additional smart contract risk, additional operational exposure, additional settlement steps. This transaction uses the public XRP Ledger directly. The bridge is gone. Every step removed from a financial settlement process is a documented reduction in operational risk, counterparty exposure, and settlement complexity. The progression from the prior pilot to this transaction is not noise. It is the documented signal of institutional infrastructure, being refined toward production scale. Treasury Act 2. Who did this and why it matters? Reactor 930. To understand the significance of this transaction, you have to understand the documented institutional weight of the two entities who participated. JPMorgan Chase has a documented history with distributed ledger technology that predates this transaction by nearly a decade. In 2019, JPMorgan launched JPM Coin, a proprietary dollar-backed digital instrument designed for wholesale institutional transfers between institutional clients. At the time, it was the first digital currency created by a major U.S. bank. They built Onyx, an entire internal business unit dedicated to blockchain and digital asset infrastructure. Onyx has documented products including LeInc, a peer-to-peer information network for financial institutions, and JPM Coin Systems, serving institutional payment clients. They have published documented research on tokenized assets, digital payment networks, and programmable money across multiple iterations over multiple years. JPMorgan does not experiment publicly without documented diligence behind it. Their forays into blockchain infrastructure have each been deliberate, phased, and followed by expanded deployment when the prior phase validated. The pattern of their documented engagement is itself evidence of how seriously they assess infrastructure before committing to it operationally. Mastercard's documented blockchain engagement follows a parallel institutional track. Their multi-token network, known as MTN, is a documented institutional digital asset settlement platform designed for banks and financial institutions to tokenize, trade, and settle real-world assets. It is not a consumer product. It is institutional infrastructure. Mastercard's Agent Pay, announced in public documentation in 2025, is a machine-to-machine payment product, specifically designed for AI agents and automated systems to conduct transactions on behalf of institutions. The documented partnership for Agent Pay includes Ripple. And that relationship, announced publicly, confirmed publicly, and documented in both companies' statements, is the institutional relationship that contextualizes this Treasury transaction. Mastercard did not arrive at the XRP Ledger through this Treasury transfer for the first time. They arrived at it through a documented relationship with Ripple that has been building on the public record. Here's what that means for the institutions that are watching this. When JPMorgan and Mastercard execute a live transaction on specific infrastructure, they are not experimenting. They have already experimented. They have already evaluated. Their compliance teams have reviewed the ledger's transaction history, 14 years of it, publicly available, cryptographically signed. Their risk officers have assessed the finality characteristics. Their legal teams have reviewed the regulatory landscape in every jurisdiction where this infrastructure operates. Live transactions are what comes after all of that documented diligence. The conclusion, documented in the transaction record, was the public XRP Ledger. Treasury Act 3, the XRP Ledger's role, 9/30/1530. The question that institutional decision-makers ask when evaluating settlement infrastructure is not which blockchain is most talked about. It is not which blockchain has the most retail interest. It is, what are the documented characteristics of this system, and do they meet our operational requirements? The XRP Ledger's documented characteristics are on the public record. Settlement finality, 3 to 5 seconds from transaction submission to confirmed final settlement. This is not a marketing claim. It is the documented median over more than 14 years of continuous ledger operation. Transaction cost, a fraction of a cent per transaction, regardless of the value transferred. Moving $1 and moving $1 billion on the XRP ledger cost the same fractional amount. For institutions moving large Treasury positions, the cost structure is not incidental. It is an operational efficiency advantage over traditional settlement rails that charge basis points on notional value. Ledger uptime. The XRP ledger has operated continuously since 2012. Over 14 years of documented operational history without a permanent halt. Auditability. Every transaction is permanently and publicly recorded. Every transfer is cryptographically signed by the authorizing parties. Every settlement is time-stamped in a ledger that cannot be altered retroactively. This is not a compliance feature that was added on top of the protocol. It is the foundational architecture. For institutional Treasury settlement specifically, two properties are non-negotiable: finality and auditability. A settlement that appears to complete but can be unwound is not a settlement. It is a credit exposure. Traditional payment rails, including correspondent banking and settlement systems like Fedwire, have settlement windows during which transactions are not final. The XRP Ledger's documented consensus mechanism provides real finality. The transaction that appeared confirmed in the ledger is the transaction that settled. There is no settlement risk window. There is no counterparty exposure period during which one party has transferred value and the other party has not yet received it on an irrevocable basis. The XLS standards, the documented technical protocol extensions for the XRP ledger, provide the structured framework for tokenized real-world assets. Under these standards, a U.S. Treasury instrument can be represented as a documented on-ledger token, issued, transferred, and redeemed with cryptographic certainty and ledger finality. The prior pilot documented the architecture, moving a Treasury fund between a public chain and a permissioned chain. That required bridge infrastructure, additional smart contract layers, additional operational steps, additional points of potential failure. The current transaction uses the public XRP ledger directly. The documented reduction in architectural complexity between those two events is the record of institutional infrastructure being streamlined toward production efficiency. For the compliance officers, technology evaluators, and institutional investors who will watch this, the XRP Ledger provided documented answers to every operational requirement that a Treasury settlement mandates. That is why it was selected. Xerxes Act 4, the Institutional Infrastructure Picture, 1530-21 OED. Now let us place this transaction inside the documented context that surrounds it, because this transaction did not happen in isolation. In the same reporting window, within the same news cycle in which this Treasury transaction was confirmed, 3 additional institutional moves were documented simultaneously. This is the pattern the intelligence record shows. First, Ripple received preliminary CASP approval in Luxembourg under the European Union's Markets in Crypto Assets Regulation, MiCA. The July 1st, 2026 deadline for crypto asset service providers to hold license status under the MiCA framework is one of the most consequential regulatory milestones in European financial history. The MiCA framework covers the entire European Union, 27 member states, 450 million consumers, and a combined GDP that makes it one of the 2 largest economic blocs on Earth. Ripple received preliminary approval before that deadline. Established institutions executing live transactions on infrastructure require documented legal clarity in every jurisdiction where that infrastructure will be deployed at scale. The documented record now shows that Ripple holds a documented regulatory footprint in the European Union's MiCA framework, ahead of the deadline that governs the entire European crypto asset service industry. For the JPMorgan and Mastercard transaction to have implications in Europe, which it will, given that cross-border Treasury transfers cross multiple jurisdictions, the regulatory status of the infrastructure operator in Europe is not incidental. It is required. Second, Ripple completed a documented strategic investment in Flutterwave, one of Africa's largest and most established fintech platforms. RLUSD and Ripple payments are confirmed to be deployed through Flutterwave's existing network. Africa's cross-border remittance corridor is among the most expensive in the documented world by percentage fee. World Bank data consistently records Sub-Saharan Africa as carrying the highest average remittance costs of any region globally, frequently exceeding 8 to 12% of the transferred amount. For a worker sending $200 home to family, that is $16 to $24 in fees on every single transfer. The partnership between Ripple and Flutterwave is a documented institutional response to a documented market failure. It is verifiable. It is signed. It is named parties and confirmed products. And it represents a deployment path for XRPL infrastructure into a market that processes over $100 billion in annual remittance volume. Third, Ripple secured a $200 million credit facility from Neuberger Berman, a firm managing over $500 billion in client assets. This credit line expands Ripple Prime, the institutional prime brokerage division. Prime brokerage is not a retail financial product. It is not an exchange or a consumer app. Prime brokerage is how institutional investors, hedge funds, asset managers, sovereign wealth funds access financial markets with leverage, custody, margin lending, and settlement services. The prime brokerage relationship is one of the most scrutinized in institutional finance. Prime brokers have visibility into their clients' positions, collateral, and risk exposure. No institutional client enters a prime brokerage relationship without extensive due diligence on both sides. Neuberger Berman's decision to extend $200 million to Ripple Prime is a documented institutional endorsement from one of the most established and scrutinized asset managers on Wall Street. One confirmed Treasury transaction, a preliminary regulatory license in the world's largest economic bloc, a fintech investment targeting $100 billion in African remittance volume, a $200 million institutional credit line from a $500 billion asset manager, all documented, all independently verifiable, all occurring within the same reporting window. This is the pattern. Not a prediction about what the pattern produces, not speculation about price targets, the documented record of what is being built, who is building it, and what infrastructure they are building on. For Attack 5, The Responsible Close, 21 Sakrin 23. At XRP Chronicle, we close every documentary the same way, with a clear documented accounting of what we know and what we do not. What is documented? JPMorgan and Mastercard executed a cross-border tokenized U.S. Treasury transfer on the XRP Ledger. That transaction occurred. That transaction is in the record. What remains open? The complete technical specification of the transaction, exact volume transferred, complete mechanism details, has not been released in a form that allows full independent verification by third parties. The confirmed record establishes the event. The granular detail remains incomplete in the public record. What is documented? Ripple's MECA approval is preliminary. The Luxembourg regulatory process has additional documented steps before full CASP status is confirmed under MyCA. What remains open? The specific conditions and timeline for full MyCA approval and whether any conditions attached to the preliminary status are not yet in the public record. What is documented? This transaction follows a documented prior pilot. The institutional relationship between JPMorgan, Mastercard, and XRP Ledger infrastructure is a documented progression. What remains open? Whether this progression leads to scaled deployment, additional institutional participants, or expanded transaction volume. That is what the documented record does not yet show us. We report what is confirmed. We mark clearly what is not. That discipline is not a limitation. It is the foundation of the trust you have placed in this channel. What is confirmed is historically significant. JPMorgan Chase, Mastercard, a live cross-border United States Treasury transfer, the XRP Ledger. The story is documented, and the story is just getting started. Director Outro to 23 Directs 2330. If you are tracking the infrastructure story, not the speculation, not the price targets, not the leaked documents and rumored secret plans, subscribe to XRP Chronicle 1. The full institutional breakdown, sourced and documented, is at bit.ly/XRP guide. Share this with someone who needs to understand what is actually being built. Stay locked in. Edgo's Chio Scan and Script. XRP Chronicle. Long-form documentary ready for production. Your runtime. Yan 22 minutes. Word count. Yotwan 850. Tone. Investigative, cinematic, documented sources. Bloomberg Intelligence, Cointelegraph, JPMorgan Onyx Public Documentation, Mastercard MTN Documentation, Ripple Quarterly Markets Reports, XRPL On-Chain Data, XRP Ledger Foundation Developer Documentation, HWAT,